Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a stack of material that, honestly, it just lays bare the final, brutal stages of a media empire built on absolute control. An empire that really started to consume itself when that control finally slipped.
Yeah, we're talking about Sumner Redstone, the man who famously, almost violently, declared content is king.
And he absolutely meant it. We're looking at how that iron grip, that refusal to ever let go, led to one of the messiest, most high-stakes corporate battles imaginable right at the end.
It's fascinating and kind of tragic, really. You have this colossal dynasty, Viacom, CBS, Paramount, built on this core belief in owning the stuff, the actual movies, the shows.
He got that early on, didn't he? While others were building the pipes, he wanted the water. Came from his background, transforming that family drive-in business into, well, into Viacom.
Exactly. A brilliant, super aggressive lawyer from Boston who understood value, but the way he ran it, absolute centralized authority, and not just his title, but the legal structures, like that famous voting trust, designed to keep him in power forever, essentially.
Which was his whole deal, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That desire for total, unshakable control. I mean, look at how he got Viacom in the first place, that legendary hostile takeover in the 80s. He risked everything.
He really did, and he wasn't shy about saying he'd live forever, never give up power, which, sounds strong, but it creates this massive vulnerability deep inside the company.
A vulnerability everyone eventually had to deal with. His executives, his own family.
And that's where our sources really zero in. That moment when his control was finally challenged, when time started catching up, we're going deep into the actions of the top execs, Philippe Dauman at Viacom, Les Moonves at CBS, and, crucially, his daughter, Sherry Redstone.
So the mission today: unpack this corporate civil war. Look at the audacious moves, the desperate gambits, the fight over who really held the power when the king could no longer rule unchallenged.
Okay, so let's start with that foundation. Redstone's core belief. Content is king. This wasn't just a slogan for him.
No, it was everything. The absolute driving force behind decades of acquisitions and, frankly, ruthless corporate behavior. Own the assets. That was the gospel, according to Sumner.
And you see it play out again and again. While competitors were maybe focusing on cable infrastructure or retail, Redstone went after the libraries. Paramount Pictures, MTV, Nickelodeon. He saw that owning those characters, those stories, those brands was the real long-term play.
Because you could just repackage and resell it forever, right? VHS, then cable, international markets, eventually streaming.
Exactly. It was about owning the intellectual property. That was the enduring value. A 50-year-old movie could still make money. A cartoon character could launch new shows, merchandise. It was incredibly prescient.
But that aggressive pursuit wasn't just about old Hollywood, was it? When the digital world started exploding, Viacom knew they had to apply the Redstone playbook. If it's the new content frontier, you got to own it.
Which brings us to this almost unbelievable moment revealed in the sources, a move that, if it had actually happened, would have completely changed the media landscape we know today.
You're talking about the Facebook bid.
Yeah. The $1.5 billion bid for Facebook back in 2006.
It seems crazy now looking back, but it shows just how seriously Viacom, under Redstone's influence, was trying to dominate this new digital content space.
Absolutely. The sources are clear. The top brass at Viacom, Tom Freston, Michael McGrath, and Redstone himself, they wanted very badly to own Facebook. They saw this platform mastering user content, social connection, and thought, okay, that's the next big content asset. We need it.
Okay, let's pause on that number, though. $1.5 billion. In 2006, Facebook was, what, 2 years old? Barely out of college dorms.
It was a staggering figure, almost unheard of for a company that young that hadn't even really figured out monetization yet. It just screams urgency, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You need to stay relevant, to own the future.
And the offer itself was pretty specific, right? Not just a vague number thrown out there.
No, it was structured. The sources detail it. 51% cash up front. That's over $750 million in cash. The rest was tied to performance payouts over time. So, some protection for Viacom, but still, a massive cash commitment.
It was serious.
Yeah.
The sources call it Facebook's most significant and concrete offer they'd received up to that point.
Definitely. So here you have Viacom, the content king, history of hostile takeovers, deep pockets, laying down this huge bet on the future of content.
And what did Mark Zuckerberg, this young founder, do in response?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Didn't even reply. Just silence.
Wow. That silence speaks volumes, doesn't it? It's more than just a missed deal. It's like a collision of two worlds.
It really is. Redstone's world was about acquisition, confrontation, owning things outright. He knew how to win those battles. But here, he's faced with this new Silicon Valley culture founder control, maybe a different kind of long game, and just being ignored. That must have been infuriating.
It highlights the limits of that own everything approach when the nature of content and control starts shifting, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You see this pattern sometimes, like with the FTX founders maybe valuing their internal systems over outside rules, or tech founders generally mastering reticence to keep control. Zuckerberg held his ground. And Viacom's inability to grab that next-gen platform content, that became a major strategic gap for them down the line, a really painful one.
Okay, so the failure to conquer the digital frontier eventually gives way to this much uglier internal fight over the traditional crown jewels. Let's talk about Paramount Pictures.
Right. As Sumner Redstone's health started to decline, visibly decline, the power vacuum started sucking people in. It set the stage for, well, a classic succession crisis.
Who are the main players in this?
You had Redstone himself, still technically in control via the trust. You had his daughter, Sherry Redstone, who was increasingly trying to assert her influence and, protect her father's interests, or perhaps her own. And then the two big CEOs running the separate companies Viacom had been split into, Philip Dauman at Viacom.
The one often described as Redstone's protege, even his mentor figure in some ways.
That was the image, yeah. Longtime lawyer, close advisor. And then you had Les Moonves, the very successful, very powerful CEO running CBS. And the key thing the sources emphasize is the relationship between Dauman and Shari. It wasn't just disagreement, it was described as deep hostility.
So tension was already high. What was the spark that lit the fuse?
The proposed sale of a big chunk of Paramount Pictures.
Why Paramount? And why then, specifically?
Well, Viacom, particularly the film studio side, was struggling financially. The timing is important here. A quarterly report around February 2016 showed Paramount had lost, I think it was over $100 million in just 3 months.
Ouch. Okay, so there's a financial justification, maybe? A need for cash?
There is definitely a financial argument to be made, but for Dauman, this was much more than just shoring up the balance sheet. He saw his own power base shrinking as Sherry got closer to her father.
So selling a stake in Paramount wasn't just about money.
No, it was a political power play, a high-stakes gamble. Dauman apparently believed he could get such an extraordinary price for the Paramount stake that it would be undeniable proof of his leadership.
He thought the sheer financial win would shut down any opposition.
That seems to have been the calculation, that a huge influx of cash would quell all opposition, even from Sherry and the family side, basically make himself politically untouchable through a massive deal involving Viacom's most iconic asset.
A bold move. But did he think he had the authority? Did he claim Sumner was okay with selling off part of Paramount?
He absolutely claimed he did. This is critical. Dauman's story was that he'd gotten Sumner's consent. He mentioned a specific whispered conversation and then said it was formally approved at a board meeting later.
But the sources suggest there was a sense of desperation behind this.
Oh, yeah. Dauman himself reportedly acknowledged that if Sherry really managed to consolidate control around her father, his own days were numbered. Given the hostility between them, he saw this Paramount sale as maybe his only shot, a preemptive strike, really, against Sherry.
Which meant he had to walk a very fine line regarding Sumner's health before making this move, didn't he?
Exactly. This is where you see the legal strategy starting to form. Before trying to sell the stake, Dauman made a point of stating publicly that, based on his meetings with Sumner back in October, November the previous year, he'd made no observations about Mr. Redstone's capacity to make significant business decisions.
So establish a baseline. Sumner was fine just a few months ago. He agreed to my plans.
Precisely. It positions Dauman as the loyal executive carrying out the founder's wishes. It frames the Paramount sale not as his idea, but as something Sumner, in his right mind, had approved. It was all set up.
A setup that completely collapsed once Sherry moved to block the sale, or just didn't pan out the way he'd hoped.
Right. And when that carefully constructed narrative failed, he had to pivot. Hard.
And that pivot was dramatic, from Sumner's fine to, well, something very different.
Completely different. Once the Paramount sale gambit failed, Dauman's entire story flipped. He went from saying Sumner was capable to arguing he was basically incapacitated and, crucially, being manipulated.
This 180-degree turn on Sumner's capacity seems like the core legal tactic now. How did Dauman justify this sudden change? He'd just said Sumner was making decisions months earlier.
His key piece of evidence, or at least his key claim, centered on a visit he said he made to Sumner in the first week of March. So just a few months after those October-November meetings.
And what did he claim happened in March?
He testified that Sumner appeared almost totally non-responsive and could not meaningfully communicate at all.
Wow. So the argument becomes, the Sumner I dealt with in the fall was capable, but the Sumner now, in the spring, is a different person, completely unable to communicate or decide anything.
That was the core of it. That rapid deterioration conveniently happening after the alleged consent for the Paramount sale, but before the current power struggle, was Doman's legal lifeline. It turned a boardroom fight into a full-blown legal war over Sumner Redstone's basic competency.
And waging that war meant launching a direct attack on Sherry Redstone, didn't it? Accusing her of, well, of taking over.
He didn't hold back at all. The legal filings became incredibly personal and explosive. Dahmen flat out claims Sumner is being manipulated by his daughter, Sherry.
What specific things did he accuse her of doing?
The accusations were severe. Things like she had inserted herself into his home, taken over his life, isolated him from contact with others, and purports to speak for him. Basically, painting a picture of elder abuse and manipulation.
And the motive he alleged.
Pure self-interest, according to Dahmen. He claimed Sherry was doing all this to dismantle his estate plan, to serve her own interests, and to assume control of his businesses, which he long refused her.
That lays it all bare, doesn't it? It's the classic story of a dynastic power struggle. Forget the stock price for a minute. This is about who physically controls the patriarch, who controls the flow of information to and from him.
It really echoes other situations with powerful aging titans who become isolated, doesn't it? You think of Howard Hughes, maybe, in his final years.
Right, creating these elaborate systems, forcing people, even his wife, to go through intermediaries just to talk to him. Isolation as a tool of control, or maybe a symptom of decline that enables control by others.
Exactly. And when Dahmen accused Sherry of isolating Sumner, he was essentially saying she'd created that same kind of information lockdown, made it impossible for anyone else to know what Sumner really wanted, assuming he could even express it. That ambiguity became the battleground.
So the ultimate currency here wasn't just Viacom's stock, it was control over Sumner himself.
Absolutely. Sumner Redstone built his empire on centralized personal control. He bragged about never giving it up. That very strength, that refusal to plan for succession, basically guaranteed this kind of chaotic, ugly endgame. It became a fight over who speaks for the king. Is it the man himself or the daughter guarding the door, a daughter he'd historically kept out of the top spot?
And those allegations of isolation are potent because, as you see in these situations, when the leader's engagement fades, naturally or otherwise, that communication vacuum just breeds paranoia and conflict. Executives feel they have to fight the heir apparent just to survive.
It becomes existential for them, which pushes things towards even more extreme measures.
And extreme measures followed. The fight spilled out of the boardroom and right into the courts. Dahlman wasn't alone for long, right? Le Moonves, the CBS chief, and the independent directors at Viacom joined the fray.
They did. They launched this legal challenge that was essentially, as the sources put it, going to war with a controlling shareholder, trying to strip Sherry, who effectively controlled the voting shares, through the trust of her power.
That sounds insanely risky from a corporate governance perspective.
Yes.
Suing the person who ultimately controls the company.
It's extraordinary. It signals absolute desperation. It tells you Dahmen, Moonves, and those directors were convinced they had zero future if Sherry cemented her control. But taking that step, that incredibly aggressive step, immediately put Les Moonves under a microscope.
And this is where it gets even more complicated, because Moonves had his own vulnerabilities lurking in the background. Issues that later exploded publicly.
Right. The Me Too issues that eventually brought him down. But there's this incredible, almost perverse irony noted in the source material regarding his decision to sue Sherry.
What's the irony?
Well, for some observers at the time, the very fact that Moonves was willing to launch this high-risk lawsuit against Sherry seemed to argue for his innocence regarding consensual misconduct.
How does that work?
The thinking was, what CEO in his right mind would pick this massive fight with the controlling shareholder if he knew he had skeletons in his closet? Skeletons that could easily be dug up and used against him. It seemed like an act of confidence almost, like he felt he had nothing to hide.
A dangerous gamble, though. Because his position, his reputation, his continued leadership at CBS was actually central to the legal case against Sherry, wasn't it?
Absolutely critical. The independent directors were basically arguing, we need to keep the professional management in place, led by the highly successful Les Moonves, free from Sherry's interference. So anything that threatened Moonves' status, anything that questioned his judgment or conduct, could potentially blow up their entire legal strategy. It had an enormous impact, as the sources say.
The whole house of cards rested on the perceived integrity and indispensability of the executives fighting Sherry.
And Moonves knew just how precarious that was. The sources reveal these incredibly tense, desperate moments where he's trying to manage this personal risk while waging corporate war.
Like the situation with Bobby Phillips.
Exactly. He's begging an intermediary to keep her quiet, saying things like, "If Bobby talks, I'm finished," pleading with her to wait until Wednesday until speaking to anyone. You see this picture of a CEO juggling existential threats on multiple fronts: the battle for Viacom's future and the battle to save his own skin.
And underlying all this drama, all this risk and desperation, is just the sheer amount of money and power at stake. We shouldn't forget that.
Definitely not. You look at the executive compensation figures. Dome, for instance, paid $84.5 million in just 1 year, 2010. These aren't small disagreements. They're billion-dollar battles for control over global media empires.
So the whole saga really becomes this textbook example of corporate warfare, driven by ambition, using everything available: health claims, asset sales, legal maneuvers.
Sacrificing loyalty, risking the stability of these huge public companies. It really mirrors that sort of Titan mentality we've seen historically, like Andrew Carnegie insisting he never had labor trouble while crushing unions at places like Edgar Thomson to maintain absolute control. There's often a huge gap between the public image and the ruthless reality of maintaining power.
And that control often relies on controlling information, secrecy, whether it's Theranos with its locked rooms or WeWork's tightly managed narrative.
Right. And in Redstone's case, that need for control and the fight over it ultimately descended into litigating whether the man could even communicate. It shows what happens when power is so centralized. Any crack, any perceived weakness at the very top just leads to chaos.
And the executives, with their huge pay packages on the line, they'll use any weapon they can find in that chaos.
Even if it means risking the very empire they're supposed to be running. Hashtag tag outro.
So looking back at this deep dive, we've gone from, the almost unbelievable scale of that $1.5 billion Facebook bid, Redstone's content is king, ambition, reaching for the digital future.
All the way down to these incredibly raw, personal, and frankly, ugly legal fights. Courtroom testimony about whether an old man could nod his head or whisper. It's quite the trajectory.
The source material really shows a world where the drive for absolute control, the kind Sumner Redstone embodied, means everything becomes a weapon. Loyalty, finance, even a person's health. Nothing is sacred when the stakes are that high.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is that the kind of intense, centralized personal control that built Viacom, that content is king philosophy personified by Redstone, it just doesn't have a clean exit strategy. It almost can't survive the founder's decline without this kind of implosion.
Because he refused to plan for it. Declared he'd live forever.
Exactly. When you rule like that, blocking succession, insisting on your own immortality, you basically guarantee a messy transition. The sources paint a clear picture. It leads to executive maneuvering, accusations of isolation, desperate gambles, and enormous risks to the entire enterprise.
It seems like the very intensity needed to build these kinds of empires, that single-minded drive we see in Redstone, maybe in Carnegie, even in the focus of the Facebook founders. It almost ensures they can't end peacefully.
Which leaves us with, I guess, a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. When you look at these modern corporate empires, so often built around the force of personality of a single founder, is a peaceful transition of power even realistic? Or does the very nature of building such a thing, the sheer will required, mean that the end of the founder's reign is almost destined to be a brutal, bare-knuckle fight, like the one we saw play out with Sumner Redstone?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.